On behalf of Every Town for Gun Safety and Moms Demand, I am so excited to welcome you. You are such a champion for women across the country, and I'm just so honored that you're here today. Senator Amy Klobuchar, welcome.
I don't think I've gone anywhere around the country where I didn't see the red shirts. I tried my best, and where I didn't see incredible representatives from every town in Moms Demand Action. Literally every state in the country, smallest towns, biggest towns, and it has made such a difference. And I hope people realize that. As you look at where this country is on these issues, state by state by state, compared to where they were, say, a decade or two ago. We're seeing real change. And I want you to know that in the middle of these lonely times in this pandemic. And it just means a lot to be part of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And also, you mentioned the pandemic. We are so glad to hear that your husband, John, is recovering from COVID-19. And I know he's helping others now by donating blood.
He is. And, we had a scare like so many other people have had. He didn't get better and had a temperature of over 100 for like 10 days and was coughing up blood. And I was not with him because we thought he might have it, and finally got him to go in. And sure enough, he had really severe pneumonia. He was in the hospital 5 days, and it took a turn the last day for the better. And then he got out, and the only remaining symptom appears to be that he told me that he couldn't clean the basement because there was too much dust.
Interesting.
Yes, it's very interesting. It just seemed, I'm sure you may not be the only one. But anyway, what was amazing is he went down to the Mayo Clinic and ended up being able to give his plasma. And more, as sadly more people get this virus, they're going to be able to help others. And there's major work going on to get that plasma because they believe it will save other people's lives.
Well, please thank him for us and let him know that we're thinking of him. So I want to dive right in because we've got a lot to talk about. And, you've talked a lot about how women leaders are often more pragmatic and focused on getting things done, from healthcare to gun violence. So why do you think women are such effective activists?
Well, I think there was an old saying, actually, that I used to quote that actually I didn't agree with the first part, but I did the second. It said, women leaders speak softly. I don't agree with that, but women leaders speak softly and carry a big statistic. And I think that is because it was so hard early on, and it still is, for women to always be accepted as the leaders they are. And so a lot of how women have gotten there is the accountability route. And I remember when I was first running, I would look at the websites. There weren't many women in my job, and before I was senator, and I would look at Kathleen Sebelius and Janet Napolitano in Kansas, of course, in Arizona, and because they had all these goals, and then they'd show how they would meet the goals. So I did that in my local office. It did the exact same thing because I really didn't have that many role models. I was the first woman in that job and the first woman elected to the Senate from my state. And then when I got to the Senate, I realized, man, we were still in a very small group, which has improved nearly every single election. And what I think is important to remember is that the numbers are important, yes, and they can't call us a Sweet 16 like they did when I got there. We're now over a quarter of the Senate. But the numbers are important, but more important is the impact. And the studies have shown that women in the Senate actually work together better. They pass more bills. Mm-hmm. And I think about things like Senator Feinstein leading that first assault weapon ban. I think about Patty Murray, who just led this amazing effort to get the $25 billion in that last bill for testing for the virus. I think about Barbara Boxer and the work that she did on infrastructure and climate change, leading our committee. Debbie Stabenow on the Farm Bill, Kirsten Gillibrand on sexual assault in the military. And there's just such a strong history of what we've all done together. And my favorite story was actually one involving my friend Tammy Duckworth. When she was having her second child, decorated war veteran, lost her legs for our country, and still having her second kid at age 50. Unbelievable story on its own. And she says, I've got a toddler at home. I want to bring the baby to the Senate. I was the head Democrat on the Rules Committee. I said, no problem. She wanted to come bring the baby for votes. And it turned out the rule had been in place for like over a century. And I just kept bugging everyone about it. And then at one point, Orrin Hatch said to the reporters, well, okay, maybe we can have one baby on the floor, but what if we have 10 babies on the floor? And I said, we already have 10 babies on the floor. But in any case, we were able to get that done. And I'll never forget that day when she walked into the U.S. Senate with that little baby. Was just a few weeks old, Miley Pearl, in her arms in a little green sweater with a little hat on. And that baby slept through the entire historic moment. But it was historic for us. And it just means change comes to every workplace. And certainly during this pandemic, when you see all the women who are out front leading, like Speaker Pelosi, but you also see all the women on the front line, I don't think we'll ever go back to the way it was.
I totally agree with you, and I know that that is true, and that's why I encourage every woman listening to us to think about running for office. But, as the saying goes, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu, and we still have too few women at the table, and as a result, women often suffer. And, I want to talk to you about how this pandemic is putting women at greater risk of harm, not just from the virus, but also, as you know, from domestic violence. You have been a leader in this fight to protect all women, regardless of their marital status, from abusive partners by closing what's called the boyfriend loophole. What should be done in the next coronavirus relief package to protect women from domestic violence, to support survivors, and ultimately to keep guns out of the hands of abusive partners?
This is so critical. We have just a case in our state that just broke my heart. It was in a suburb, and the man reported his wife missing, and there were search crews that were coming out to look for her. He said she went on a walk. She was a hardworking person, and the police got suspicious, and they brought in some dogs, and he had strangled her, plastic bag, put her under the crawl space. And that's where they found her during that pandemic. And we're going to see, sadly, so many tragedies like this. I'm a former prosecutor. I know that when things are tough economically, when things are hard, and people are in difficult circumstances, you see increases in domestic violence. And so many of these women have no place to go. And so that's why actually in the first bill that we did, I helped work on this as a member of the Judiciary Committee, as did many of my colleagues, to get $2 million for the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which is so critical because it's not like people can just go out of the house sometimes and leave now. They have nowhere to go. And so the hotline becomes more critical, and then $45 million for shelter, which is even more important. And so Lisa Murkowski, the Republican from Alaska, and I are actually leading an effort in the Senate to get more funding in this next bill. And I can't tell you how important this is because we're just seeing the beginning of this with this increase to calls to the hotline. Yes. At the same time, getting to the work of every town and Moms Demand Action, we're seeing an increase in gun purchases, and then we're not seeing the resources or the ability to do the background checks. And obviously, you've got to complete those background checks before you sell anyone a gun. And all of that is colliding at the same time. So we're very, very concerned about it. And I think it's important for those on the call to know that, well, of course, we're focused on the immediate, getting the equipment and getting the testing. But there's also something that's happened immediately that is, as usual, the silent killer. It's the thing behind the bedroom door that no one wants to talk about. And we have to not forget the lessons of the past and continue moving forward on gun safety measures as well as domestic violence, including closing the boyfriend loophole, which I've led in the Senate, and my friend Debbie Dingell has led in the House. And we worked with the Gabby Giffords Foundation on this. And what the bill does is basically say, okay, if you have got a domestic violence conviction or stalking, you can't just go out there and get a gun. And there's so many statistics that show how important it would be to close this loophole. And also, it says just because you're not married to someone, but if they're your boyfriend and you've convicted of domestic violence, the same thing applies. As one conservative sheriff from Racine, Wisconsin said to us at one hearing, bad boyfriends kill just as hard and hit just as hard as bad husbands. And so that's what we have to remember.
You know, you've spoken a lot about the need to elect a president who will fight for stronger gun laws. How do you think candidates across the country should be talking about this issue as they campaign over the next 6 months?
I think that they've got to listen to their constituents and to see these ordinary people that have done extraordinary things, whether it was that mom in El Paso who put herself over her child to save her child's life, the grandpa who is a veteran who saved people in that store. All over the country, you see this happening. So I think we've got to put candidates in place that have the courage to do what these ordinary citizens are doing. And so the key is to do what every Town and Moms Demand Action have done, which is to basically show up, ask people questions. And now we know we can't go to the big rallies anymore and stand in the front row with the red shirt like you guys do.
I know, but we can do it here on Zoom.
You can do it on Zoom.
Here.
You can do it online. More and more people are just getting their message and getting their communications that way. You can call the office of the candidates and your elected official. And most importantly, you can choose candidates that you think are going to be supportive and then push for them to be the ones that win. And you can do that so many different ways, making small contributions, getting on phone trees, calling people, getting involved in campaigns. And it's not always just the national race. Sometimes it's the local race or the state legislature. So many of this change is going on that basis, as you know, Shannon.
You know, we know that 90% of Americans support stronger gun laws, 80% of gun owners, even 74% of NRA members, they support things like a background check on every gun sale. And I've heard you talk about this before, your approach to gun safety legislation through the lens of, would this hurt my Uncle Dick in the deer stand? And I get that as a Midwesterner. So
on the debate stage a few times, yes.
Yes, and I think that's a good lens. And so, what can we do to show lawmakers that the vast majority of gun owners support common sense gun laws?
Well, you just put the statistics out there. I think it's really important to know the numbers and know the facts, no matter how much the White House doesn't care about facts. Most people do. And I've been so shocked by what's happened since Parkland and since Sandy Hook and so many others. Of course, the everyday shootings that people encounter in towns every single day. And that's why we were talking about domestic violence. Those aren't mass shootings, but they hit the community in all the same ways. And so I think it's really important that we get the facts out there and that people understand. And that's why I use that example. There are so many law-abiding legal gun owners that support background checks, bans on bump stocks. They don't need that to hunt deer in my state. And I think it's really important. We could go through the list of all the bills, the red flag laws, all the things that would be helpful, assault weapon bans. And so that's why I think making that case, and I'm someone from the Midwest with a state that has that proud tradition of fishing and hunting. And I think it's very important for people to make the case, not just in the bluest of blue states, but also in those states that have more independent and Republican voters, because there's a lot of people that go with us on this issue. As long as you talk about it in a way that doesn't condemn some of their family members who simply like to hunt and want to be careful, but don't think that these laws interfere with their rights to hunt. And I think that case has to be made if we're going to get the kind of widespread support that we want and we can get in this election to get this done. And, I was the one sitting across from the president. I made this point to him after Parkland and by the way, I still kept that sheet of paper where I wrote down how many times he said that he wanted to have universal background checks. And I kept these little hash marks and put it down. I still have that piece of paper. And I did that. And guess what? The next day he met with the NRA and he folded. So we have to have candidates, yes, that can be strong for hunting and fishing, and conservation that comes with that as well, but then also are willing to stand up to the NRA.
Like you, yes, thank you. Senator, you know that we have millions of supporters and volunteers through every town, and Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action. And there was so much interest from our supporters in asking you some questions that I wanted to invite one of them to do so. Dr. Sunny Moon, she's a healthcare professional and a Moms Demand Action volunteer in New York City. And even though she retired from practicing medicine, she jumped back in when the state asked for help. And she has been volunteering at a palliative hospital in Queens. And on top of this volunteering, she's also doing the hard work of being a mom, teaching, and working full time. She has this question for you. I know.
The COVID-19 crisis disproportionately impacts people of color, but it's also a crisis that women are experiencing differently than men. What would you say to the countless women and moms who are as underwater as they've ever been because of this crisis? Thank you.
Well, thank you. And first, I want to thank you for your incredible work, for doing everything at once, for balancing things like so many people on this call do, but on top of that, volunteering. And when you look at what's going on in this country right now, you see that 70% of the nursing workforce, let's start with that, are women. And as Dr. Moon would tell you, you have people who are at the front line doing the work while they still have kids at home, when they're worried they're going to get home and infect their husband or their wife or their kids. And that happens all the time. And so I think the first is to recognize that these ordinary people are doing extraordinary things. I gave a speech on the Senate floor yesterday about immigrant healthcare workers on the front lines, because unbelievably, we haven't been able to get the administration to process visas of doctors that want to stay and help when we have such shortages. And I pled with my colleagues, and I actually quoted President Roosevelt, who was, of course, Franklin Roosevelt, the president during the Depression, during the last time we had a crisis of this magnitude. And he said, courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that there's something is greater than fear. And that's kind of paraphrasing it by memory, but that is what I'm talking about, because everyone's afraid. Those workers, those women that we know are on the front line, those immigrant workers that came to this country for a better lives for themselves and their country, they're afraid. And I told the story of a woman, a doctor at Mayo Clinic in my home state, who is an immigrant. She came and she's part of a program. She studied at a medical school here, pulmonary expert, leading a team that resuscitates patients, volunteered to help in the Bronx. And she is applying to extend her visa. Remember, graduate of a medical school here and done a residency here, and doesn't know if she can stay. She's afraid when she goes to work, but she's made the assessment that there's something bigger than that fear, and that is her mission for healthcare. And I think everyone on this call can think of something from their own life where, they're afraid the economy sucks. There's reasons that you are afraid of the job market for yourself and for your kids, but you make the assessment that you're going to hang in there and you're going to work for a cause. You're going to work for every town and Moms Demand Action and help candidates. But these healthcare workers are making the ultimate decision that there's something bigger than themselves. And that is their devotion and their mission to saving lives. And so that's what I think we have to remember. We can't deny that it's a scary time out there, and especially for the causes that we're working on. It's really scary, but we have made the assessment that courage is more important right now. And that's what I think about those healthcare workers on the front line.
Agree. Sunny is incredibly courageous. Thank you for answering that. We have actually another question for you from social media. Senator, you're known as a lawmaker who gets things done. How can you work with your GOP colleagues on gun violence prevention efforts?
Well, I think, first of all, that you have to try to find common ground whenever you can. And when you can't, you stand your ground. And this gun issue has been particularly difficult because a lot of our colleagues will say behind closed doors, I'm with you, I want to do this, I might vote for it, but then it doesn't come up for a vote because their leadership on their side is afraid of the NRA. I think we've had it with that. And I think the way that you get them to do the right thing in this case, as you know, I think I passed the most bills of any Democrat in the Senate a few years ago. A lot of those things, I found common ground on things like taking on eating disorders and getting treatment for people and infrastructure and broadband. But this one, I've gotten a few Republicans on the bill. I've gotten a lot more on the boyfriend loophole bill that would say they'd vote for it if it came up for a vote. And so you need actually to take over the Senate to make this change in a big way. Democrats do. You've got to keep the House with Speaker Pelosi's leadership. And certainly you have to take the White House with who I consider would be a fantastic president, Joe Biden, someone who has stood up to the gun lobby so many times in the past, done the right thing, understands how to build coalitions to get things done. And that's pragmatically how you get something done. You've got to build the coalition, but on something like this, you also just have to push it and stand your ground because the people are with us on this and they are out of touch, the people who have been siding with the NRA. We know that. And people have just had it. And I think that's why you saw in 2018, a bunch of candidates win in very red districts that were Democrats. And they won in part because they were willing to be courageous on this issue and they didn't give in to fear. And they were in favor of things like universal background checks and doing something about bump stocks. And then guess what happens? We win the House of Representatives because we had candidates that were authentic and believed in things. That's how we won. That's how Nancy Pelosi became Speaker. And you see this same march that we're on right now. And that's where we come into play, of course, taking back the Senate and then winning the presidency.
Yep, and our volunteers will be there every step of the way to elect a gun sense president, flip the Senate, hold the House. So we look forward to working with you. I've had so much fun talking to you. I have one more question, if you don't mind. And that is, I wonder what message you would have for my fellow Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action volunteers. They fight tirelessly for gun safety. Any advice or thoughts that you'd have for them tonight?
To remind them, as alone as this time feels, that you're not alone. We're all here together. We just can't have to give a big virtual hug, right? That you're not alone. And you think of the march that we're on. That march started the day after, to me, it started the day after the inauguration, when millions of people marched peacefully across this country. And no one expected that many people would turn out, including a bunch of people that hadn't gotten involved in politics before. And then like a week or so after that, people spontaneously showed up at airports because of that mean-spirited refugee order. Then 100 days after that, one of my favorite march, the March for Science with my favorite sign, what do we want science? When do we want it? After peer review. And that was about science. And then you go into the effort to stop the Republicans from repealing the Affordable Care Act, which is so critically important right now in the middle of this pandemic. And then, of course, Parkland and following in the work the moms had done, where then you see these young people who are still so well thought of, that were role models for people across the country. I remember so many young people at that moment coming up to me. I promise this happened. Some of them weren't even talking about guns, honestly, but they thought it was so cool that those kids were willing to stand up in Florida that they decided they would start asking me questions at events when before they would just sit in the back, They just got so much more motivated, and then they voted. or the races that we've seen, where Doug Jones, in a victory for dignity and decency, wins in the state of Alabama, or one of my favorite ones, the Republican legislator who the day of the Women's March has said, "I hope they're home in time to make dinner." That guy got defeated by an African American woman. That is the march we were on, going straight through those House races where our party united, from the most liberal to moderates to a lot of moderate Republicans and independents, behind candidates in states like Iowa and in more traditionally red districts in places like Orange County. And you saw it all over the place: Pennsylvania, Michigan. What happened? Electing these great Democratic governors. That's the march we're on. And it did not end in 2018. It did not end at any moment, including when people's races ended, like mine, for president. We all ended with some joy because we decided to unite for a cause larger than ourselves. That's the march we're on. So when you're sitting at home and, I've had my own hilarious at-home experience meeting my daughter's boyfriend's family for the first time, where she decided enough was enough after 30 seconds and took the laptop away. That was my family meeting. Or, the endless cleaning of the garage, which just goes so
I've started ironing my sheets.
Yes, a lot of, I wasn't going to say strange behavior, interesting things, good things, reading books, talking to friends. Some of it's good, but some of it's really hard when you're just sitting there and you want to be with friends and you want to be with your family, or like my case, my dad's in the assisted living and just talk to him and you can't visit anymore. These things are all really, really hard, but we have to remember that we're on this march together, and we have to also remember the progress that we've made, and we have. So I just want to thank all of you guys for including me in this. It's been really actually quite fun to be able to just talk one-on-one. I should have brought some wine or something.
Great. Yeah. Exactly. Next time, for sure.
Yeah,
you're exactly right. This is a march. We're so grateful that you are at the front of the line. And it has been my privilege to hear from one of the strongest advocates for women in this country, a true champion for gun safety in the Senate. And just thank you for being in our corner.
Well, thank you. Keep up the great work.
Have a great night. And I also want to thank everyone who has joined us on Twitter and Facebook. Just a few things before we go. First, I want to share an important reminder to anyone who is experiencing domestic violence. There is a domestic violence hotline. And it says basically, if you or someone you know is being mistreated or hurt by a partner, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline. It's available 24/7, and the phone number is 1-800-799-7233. Let me read that again, 1-800-799-7233. And if you're unavailable to speak safely, you can log into the hotline.org or text the word LOVE IS, LOVEIS, one word, to 22522. I also want to say before we close tonight that, I am a mom of 5, and because my kids are white, I have never worried that one of my children might be shot and killed while jogging. The shooting death of Ahmaud Arbery is weighing on my heart tonight, and my thoughts are with his family and his friends and the millions of Black mothers, parents, or families in America who have to worry about their children in ways that I will never worry about my own. And we all have a role to play in ending systemic racism and injustice. We will be back soon with Senator Kamala Harris on Monday, May 18th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Please join us and let us know your questions with the hashtag #DemandingWomen. And also, if you'd like to get involved with Everytown and Moms Demand Action, simply text the word READY to 64433. As always, stay safe and remember, little is more productive, persuasive, or powerful than demanding women. Thanks, everyone.